An interest in the past appears wherever human beings exist. No society, no matter how simple its way of life, has ever failed to ask how the world came into being, how people and animals first appeared, and what forces shaped their surroundings. The answers were often imaginative rather than scientific, but they served an essential purpose. They satisfied a deep human need to understand origins. Ireland offers one of the clearest examples of this instinct. From an early period, storytellers and religious specialists held respected positions because they preserved memory. Some guarded stories of kings, battles, and ancestry. Others kept religious knowledge and sacred tradition. Together, they acted as living archives of the past. Yet despite this strong historical awareness, the idea of archaeology as a discipline did not exist in early Ireland. Great monuments dotted the landscape, stone structures and ancient earthworks that must have been even more striking in the Middle Ages than they are today. Still, medieval Irish writings rarely describe these remains directly. They mention them only in passing, as background to stories, rather than objects of study. Serious attention to the physical traces of antiquity did not begin until much later. Only in the 17th century did observers start to recognise that the land itself preserved a record of earlier ages. Those who studied Ireland's past gradually divided into two broad groups. One group focused on written sources. Their work revolved around manuscripts, chronicles, genealogies, and learned texts. The other group turned their attention to what could be seen and touched. Monuments in the countryside and objects recovered from the ground. The distinction was never absolute, and neither approach was superior. Each depended on the other. Written sources without physical evidence led easily to speculation. Physical remains without historical understanding were equally misleading. Only when both were used together could the past be approached with clarity. The first major figure to study Ireland's ancient remains in a systematic way was Sir James Ware, born in Dublin at the end of the 16th century. Through education and influential contacts, he developed a strong interest in antiquities. He gathered manuscripts, consulted native scholars, and produced a series of works that laid early foundations for historical study. His books were concise but careful, especially considering the limited resources of his time. Libraries were scarce, travel was difficult, and scholarly tools were few. Later came Edward Llwyd, a scholar based in Oxford, whose travels across Celtic regions led him to compare languages and traditions across several countries. His linguistic work was published, but his archaeological observations were never properly preserved. Most of his notes were destroyed in a fire, leaving only scattered letters that hint at the precision of his observations. In the early 18th century, interest in Ireland's ancient structures grew slowly. Thomas Molyneux, a physician with a scientific bent, produced one influential study on earthworks, forts, and stone towers. His work included one of the earliest plans of Newgrange and helped ignite debates that would dominate discussion for generations. A far more controversial figure followed. Charles Vallancey, a military engineer, devoted immense energy to Irish antiquities. His enthusiasm was undeniable, but his lack of critical judgment undermined nearly everything he wrote. He drew bold conclusions based on superficial similarities between distant cultures, connecting Ireland to ancient civilizations across the world. Today, his theories appear absurd, yet they emerged at a time when modern archaeology, linguistics, and anthropology had not yet taken shape. Judged in context, his greatest achievement was not accuracy, but effort. Despite poor roads, political unrest, and the absence of maps or photography, his circle identified and recorded a remarkable number of ancient sites. That labour alone commands respect. Still, the damage caused by uncritical speculation lingered. Fantastical interpretations continued to circulate, often blending mythology, nationalism, and imagination. Even in relatively recent times, descriptions of ancient objects appeared that ignored basic observation, avoided scientific testing, and replaced evidence with dramatic storytelling. Such writing obscured understanding and reduced archaeology to fantasy. As long as this approach persisted, earlier figures could hardly be ridiculed for their errors. A reaction inevitably followed. Edward Ledwich emerged as a sharp critic of exaggerated claims about Ireland's past. Unfortunately, his corrective swung too far in the opposite direction. Driven by religious and political bias, he attributed nearly every sign of early culture to foreign invaders and portrayed pre-Christian Ireland as relentlessly primitive. His work contained useful observations, but it twisted evidence to fit ideology. In rejecting romantic excess, it replaced one distortion with another. By the early 19th century, a turning point arrived. George Petrie transformed the study of Irish antiquities. Trained as an artist, he brought discipline, patience, and attention to detail to the field. He worked at a moment when scientific methods were beginning to replace speculation. Though not fluent in Irish himself, he collaborated closely with scholars who were. His studies of Tara and early church architecture dismantled centuries of guesswork and established firm chronological foundations. For the first time, monuments were described carefully, compared systematically, and interpreted with restraint. Petrie's work was closely linked to a bold national project, the Ordnance Survey. Under its original vision, each county map would be accompanied by a detailed account of landscape, history, and antiquities. Scholars gathered information from manuscripts and local tradition, while surveyors documented what remained in the field. The ambition was extraordinary. Yet just as momentum built, the project was abruptly halted. Official explanations cited cost, but political unease likely played a deeper role. The fear of reopening historical questions proved decisive. Ironically, the cancellation may have spared archaeology from premature conclusions. Methods were still developing, and even the most diligent observers overlooked crucial evidence. Many valuable notes survive, but they require careful reassessment. Today, such a survey would be invaluable, yet time is running out. Agriculture, development, and neglect are erasing ancient remains faster than they can be recorded. While similar surveys transformed understanding elsewhere, Ireland was denied the same opportunity. Among the towering scholars of the period was John O'Donovan, whose life was devoted entirely to history, place names, and manuscripts. His output was immense. Thousands of pages in careful handwriting preserve information gathered from across the country. He edited foundational texts and attempted tasks so vast that even modern teams would struggle to complete them. Much of his work only revealed its value after his death. Alongside him stood Eugene O'Curry, whose lectures offered the first broad attempt to reconstruct ancient Irish society from native sources. His enthusiasm sometimes carried him beyond firm evidence, but his work opened paths that others would later refine. Central to all this scholarship was the growth of public collections. The Royal Irish Academy assembled artifacts, manuscripts, and inscriptions that made systematic study possible. Public donations and individual generosity secured priceless objects that might otherwise have vanished. Yet over time, private collecting and commercial dealing undermined this spirit. Objects left the country, were dispersed, or melted down. Scientific context was lost, and with it, half the value of every discovery. Official protection exists, but it remains incomplete. Only the most prominent monuments receive attention, while smaller, everyday remains disappear unnoticed. Laws designed to preserve finds are misunderstood and deliberately misrepresented, often for profit. What is truly needed is a dedicated national institution with authority, funding, and long-term vision. Ireland's importance is unique. Unlike most of Western Europe, it was never absorbed into the Roman world. Its archaeology preserves forms of life that vanished elsewhere under imperial rule. In this sense, Ireland stands alongside Scandinavia as a rare window into a non-Roman European past. That heritage carries global significance. Yet the subject remains strangely absent from education. Generations grow up knowing distant histories while remaining unaware of the extraordinary remains around them. As old beliefs that once protected monuments fade, damage accelerates. Ownership changes, land is reshaped, and ancient sites vanish silently. Before moving deeper into the story, it is useful to take a broad look at the ground ahead. Without such an overview, a newcomer can easily become lost among the many details that demand attention along the way. What follows is not a catalogue of facts, but a guided orientation through the long human journey that unfolded on this island. The development of civilization in Ireland followed the same general pattern seen across much of the world. Human history did not begin with knowledge or order, but with uncertainty. Early people entered the landscape with no understanding of the forces around them. Survival depended on trial, failure, and slow learning. At first, there was no metal, no farming, no permanent settlement. Stone tools were shaped as best they could be, and animals were hunted or fought with weapons made from what lay at hand. Over time, discovery followed discovery. Copper was found and worked. Later, it was learned that mixing copper with tin produced a harder and more useful metal. Eventually, iron was mastered, and with it came tools and weapons that reshaped societies. The age of iron, once begun, never truly ended. This sequence of technological stages, first identified in Northern Europe and later confirmed worldwide, reflects a general order rather than a strict timeline. Different regions advanced at different speeds. One society might still rely on stone, while another worked bronze, and a third had already adopted iron. These stages show relative development, not a universal clock. As research expanded, it became clear that each major stage contained many internal phases. The Stone Age alone lasted far longer than all later periods combined. Entire cultures rose and vanished within it. Skills improved, declined, and improved again. To make sense of this immense span of time, scholars divided it into broad phases. The earlier phase was marked by hunting and chipped stone tools. The later phase saw farming, settled life, and polished stone implements. Some researchers proposed an even earlier phase, though its acceptance remains debated. Metalworking ages were also subdivided. The Bronze Age showed clear regional development, while the Iron Age was shaped by changing power structures and expanding contacts. In Europe, early iron cultures emerged in the east, followed later by styles that spread westward. Eventually came the Roman expansion, its decline, and the slow transition toward medieval society. In Ireland, however, the story takes a distinctive path. No confirmed evidence has yet placed human presence on the island during the earliest Stone Age phases seen on the continent. Ireland appears to have remained untouched by those earliest developments. While future discoveries may change this picture, caution remains essential. When people did establish themselves, it was along the coast. Early communities lived from the sea, gathering shellfish and fishing the shallow waters. The interior, dense with forest and dangerous animals, remained largely uninhabited. Gradually, river routes opened paths inland. Skills improved. Tools became refined. Forests were cleared. Communities learned to cooperate, and the scale of their monuments reveals the organisation required to build them. Sea travel connected Ireland to wider networks, allowing ideas and materials to flow in. The Bronze Age arrived in Ireland without delay. Its development closely matched that of neighbouring regions, though shaped by local conditions. Ireland's rich gold resources played a crucial role. Gold became a means of exchange, linking Ireland to distant lands and securing materials not found locally. Early iron culture reached Ireland only indirectly. Isolated objects arrived from abroad, but they did not represent local traditions. The true Iron Age in Ireland began with the spread of a new artistic and technological style from Western Europe. With iron tools came new artistic forms, new social organisation, and the earliest use of writing. Oral traditions began to be recorded, laying the foundations of Irish historical literature. Unlike most of Europe, Ireland never fell under Roman control. At one moment, conquest seemed possible, but it never came. As a result, Ireland became one of the few places where non-Roman European development can be studied without interruption. This unique position gives Irish archaeology importance far beyond national boundaries. Christianity arrived gradually. Its artistic symbols blended with older traditions, producing a distinctive visual language that reached extraordinary heights centuries later. Despite frequent conflicts recorded in annals, the survival of intricate art proves that long periods of stability must have existed. Prosperity drew attention from the north. Viking raiders arrived, first as plunderers, later as settlers. Their presence reshaped towns and influenced local craftsmanship. A blended style emerged, neither fully native nor fully Scandinavian. In architecture, continental influences arrived more slowly. Romanesque forms appeared, reaching their peak in the 12th century. Some of the finest surviving structures belong to this period. Soon after, long-standing traditions were abruptly disrupted, never fully revived. Behind all this lies a central question. Did these changes come from repeated waves of new peoples, or from one population absorbing ideas from abroad? Irish tradition offers a clear answer. It speaks of successive arrivals, each reshaping the land. These stories are not literal history. They reflect myth, symbolism, and later, reinterpretation. Biblical frameworks were imposed upon them by Christian writers, reshaping older tales to fit new beliefs. Yet beneath these layers lies valuable information. The earliest stories describe a world-ending flood and its aftermath. These tales mirror flood legends found across many cultures. Later, editors reworked them to align with scripture, preserving familiar names while altering meaning. A single survivor was transformed into an immortal witness, carrying memory across ages. Such details point to older mythic origins. Later traditions speak of successive groups arriving, flourishing, suffering disaster, and departing. These stories echo one another, shaped by repetition and reinterpretation. They are not separate histories, but variations of shared themes. Eventually come figures described as masters of knowledge and skill, followed by a final group portrayed as victorious and enduring. These accounts mix memory, myth, and political identity. To understand what lies behind them, physical evidence must be examined. Human populations are classified by inherited physical traits, not language or belief. Across Europe, three broad physical types dominate. One is typically darker and long-headed, common in southern regions. Another is shorter-headed and sturdier, centred in Central Europe. The third is tall, fair, and long-headed, associated with the north. Evidence from ancient Irish burials is limited. Many remains were cremated. Others were disturbed or poorly recorded. Only a handful of collections allow meaningful analysis. Where measurements exist, they suggest that Ireland's early population was predominantly long-headed, with little sign of the round-headed type common elsewhere. Modern populations show a similar pattern. A long-headed element dominates, with later admixture visible, especially in the north. This supports the idea that cultural change in early Ireland occurred largely through contact rather than invasion. Height measurements from ancient remains suggest relatively short stature, aligning more closely with southern European populations than northern ones. This impression is reinforced by the general build of the modern population. Descriptions in early Irish literature provide another clue. These are not portraits of individuals, but idealized images reflecting cultural standards of beauty. Heroes are described with light hair and fair features. Figures portrayed negatively are often described as dark. Such patterns reveal what traits were admired and considered normal within the society. A pattern starts to emerge when the old descriptions are read side by side. Light hair is usually portrayed as something meant to be seen. Long, loose, and flowing. Dark hair, on the other hand, is typically described as cut close, trimmed down, or kept short in a way that feels deliberate. There is one striking exception, where foreign giants are described differently, but the rule holds almost everywhere else. Even the vocabulary supports this contrast. The language commonly treats fair hair as a mane, a word that evokes length, movement, and presence. Dark hair is described with a term that carries the sense of shaving and stripping down, closer to the idea of a bare scalp than a hairstyle. That term is often paired with words that reinforce the image. Round-cropped, brown-cropped, black-cropped. It is rare to see it paired with words suggesting fairness. That detail becomes difficult to ignore when placed alongside a legal tradition that speaks in the same visual language. In early law, social rank is tied to visible signs, and one line of interpretation links the manners of servitude with the idea of tonsure or enforced cropping. In other words, status was not just lived, it was worn on the body. Hair, in this world, was not merely personal appearance. It acted like a social marker. Some descriptions complicate the picture, but even the complications reveal something important. A few characters are given mixed or shifting features. A face described in two colours. Eyes described as if they could change. Hair presented as layered in shades. These strange composite portraits feel less like literal observation and more like a writer struggling to reconcile different versions of the same hero. In one note that seems to have slipped into a manuscript, a character is described as having one eye gentle and the other fierce, explained as a changeable expression rather than a physical contradiction. That kind of comment almost exposes the process behind the text. Older materials being stitched together, sometimes awkwardly, into a single narrative. Taken as a whole, the early passages allow a rough social map to be drawn. There are people presented as high-status figures, associated with long fair hair and a kind of luminous appearance. Then, there are figures placed lower in the order, described as dark-haired and closely shorn, sometimes even with words that sound contemptuous, as if their bodies are being described with the same tone as their social role. It would be easy to misunderstand the repeated use of words that translate as big or great in these darker descriptions. This does not necessarily mean tall in the modern sense. In many contexts, it reads more like an insult. Heavy, rough, lumpish, the sort of word used to reduce someone to a clumsy shape rather than to measure their height. The intention often feels social, not anatomical. And then there is one figure who refuses to fit neatly into the pattern. The great champion associated with Ulster is often described as dark and close-cropped, the very opposite of the heroic ideal used elsewhere. At first, this seems like a contradiction. Yet the story begins to make more sense when the character is treated not as a purely local creation, but as a figure with an outsider's origin embedded in the tradition. His other name and the hints that attach him to a foreign group push the narrative in a particular direction. He is repeatedly framed as different, exempt from a mysterious affliction that strikes the people around him at a critical moment, and marked out as a man who does not fully belong to the community that celebrates him. In a society obsessed with lineage, that kind of detail is rarely accidental. His legend also carries traits that suggest a memory of something real beneath the myth. Extraordinary violence, fierce unpredictability, tales of extreme bodily episodes during moments of excitement, and a recurring theme of small stature turning into outsized reputation. In the logic of heroic storytelling, these elements become mythic. In the logic of cultural memory, they can preserve fragments of a stranger brought in, feared, admired, and slowly transformed into a symbol. When the next major manuscript is examined, the same general rule appears again. Fairness is repeatedly linked to noble appearance. Long hair, bright features, eyes described as clear and royal. Dark traits are used most often when a writer wants to reduce a person's standing or paint them as threatening, rough, or grotesque. Some figures are described with hair that is fresh-shaven, cropped, or rough, while admired characters are given hair that falls to the shoulders, hangs in thick locks, or shines like metal in sunlight. The texts also reveal uncertainty in a few cases, especially in descriptions of famous warriors. A character's hair may be described one way in one passage and differently elsewhere, sometimes even described as containing more than one colour. This does not weaken the pattern. It strengthens the idea that these portraits were not taken from life, but assembled from tradition. The writers were working with inherited material, sometimes with conflicting versions, and they shaped it into forms that fit the values of their own world. Another clue appears in repeated references to broad faces. Broad facial structure often correlates with a different physical type than the long-headed population that dominates most of the evidence. The number of such descriptions is small, and they frequently appear alongside darker colouring. This suggests not a replacement of the population, but the presence of a limited outside element, a minor strain that never became dominant. Overall, the descriptions do not demand perfect consistency. In fact, too much consistency would be suspicious, like a mechanical template stamped onto every character. Instead, the mixture of strong pattern and occasional variation matches the reality of real populations, blending exceptions, contradictions, and gradual change. There is enough irregularity to feel human and enough uniformity to reveal a cultural rule. When two human types are described so clearly that even writers with no scientific interest can separate them by appearance and rank, two conclusions usually follow. First, intermarriage was limited, discouraged, or blocked by social barriers. Second, the ruling layer was likely an arriving group that established dominance over an earlier population and held power long enough for hierarchy to become normal. With that in mind, the old invasion traditions take on a different meaning. Earlier stories that repeat the same basic pattern of arrival, settlement, disaster, and disappearance begin to look like the origin story the older population told about itself, reshaped and rewritten over time. The later story, in which a sea-born warrior group arrives with superior power and takes the land, reads like a conquest narrative told from the viewpoint of the winners. Meanwhile, the monstrous pirate figures of folklore, described as deformed and terrifying, and led by a furious woman of nightmare imagery, can be understood as the same event remembered by the defeated. It is conquest seen from below, turned into horror. The likely reality behind such traditions is not an enormous migration that replaced everyone. It is more consistent with a smaller incoming elite, holding territory through a kind of early feudal power. The pattern resembles later moments in European history, where a new ruling class arrives, builds defensible sites, and reshapes social life without changing the population completely. In Ireland, lake settlements emerge after the beginning of the iron-using period, and they do not hold up as truly earlier Bronze Age structures when examined carefully. That timing matters. It points to a new order being established at the start of the Iron Age, rather than in the distant earlier past. One legendary group is set aside in this reconstruction because it belongs to a different category. It functions less like a historical people and more like a transformed pantheon, a divine or semi-divine population converted into story. Their place in tradition is real, but their role is not the same as the other arrivals that appear to encode social memory. What remains is a plausible outline. The culture of the Iron Age, along with the dominant language that later defined the island, likely came with the fair-featured elite, described as heroic, bright, and long-haired. Their advantage would have been remembered as the terrible new power of iron weapons, preserved in later tales as blades that shine with unnatural light. Yet the majority of the modern population appears to descend from the earlier, darker, shorter, long-headed stock that lived in Ireland before that transformation. At first glance, it might seem natural to expect the closest parallels to be found in parts of Scotland where older languages and social systems survived longest. But that assumption confuses culture with biology. Language and institutions can spread or vanish without matching the movement of bloodlines. Social identity changes faster than bodies do. For that reason, the safest description is the simplest. The earlier population belongs to the same broad, physical family found around the Western Mediterranean, often loosely labelled with names that suggest Spain or Iberia. Yet even that label risks claiming too much. A neutral term works better, one that avoids guessing origins that cannot be proved. The clearest name is simply this: the people who lived in Ireland before the arrival of the Iron Age culture and the language that later shaped the island's identity. In other words, a pre-Celtic population. Not as a myth, but as a practical way to describe what the evidence implies. Before any detailed excavation or classification begins, three core problems stand in the foreground. First, what kind of land did the earliest people encounter when they first reached Ireland? Not Ireland as it looks on modern maps, but the island as it existed at the very moment human feet first touched its shore. Second, where did these first arrivals come from, and how did they manage to find their way across open water? Third, what level of skill and technology did they already possess when they landed? A full answer to the first question would require a complete retelling of Ireland's geological past, because every landscape is the final result of long chains of cause and effect. But a documentary approach doesn't need to disappear into deep time. It is enough to set aside the vast ages that came before humanity and focus on a practical question. When did people arrive here at all? For Ireland, there is still no universally accepted proof that humans lived on the island during the earliest known stages of human prehistory seen in parts of continental Europe. From time to time, claims have been made. Certain stone pieces have been presented as extremely ancient tools. Some researchers have argued that flints found under glacial deposits must be human-made and therefore incredibly old. Others have claimed to recognise the fingerprints of the earliest tool makers in stones collected along Irish and Scottish coasts. But whenever these objects are tested against close scrutiny, the certainty dissolves. Committees and specialists have repeatedly concluded that many of these alleged tools show no reliable signs of deliberate shaping. In some cases, the stones look more like natural fragments produced by pressure, erosion, and ice, rather than anything cut by human hands. There is another difficulty as well. Geological context matters as much as the object itself. A tool cannot be older than the layer that holds it, and if a layer formed after the last glaciers withdrew, then it cannot contain evidence from a truly ancient Ice Age population. This problem repeatedly appears in debates about early Irish flints. Some pieces were once pushed far back in time simply because they looked primitive. Yet the surrounding geology often points toward a later date. To understand why this matters, the coast itself has to be reimagined. After the last ice sheets retreated, the land did not simply settle into the shape seen today. Sea levels and land levels shifted repeatedly. In some phases, land that is now underwater stood exposed as dry ground. In other phases, areas that are now dry were drowned beneath the sea. The clearest traces of these movements can be read in old shorelines that now sit high above the modern tide. In parts of northern Britain, an ancient shoreline can still be traced far above the present sea. It marks a time when the land sat lower and the sea reached higher. Later, the land rose again, lifting that old beach into the air like a fossilized coastline. Another shoreline higher up records a different stage of the same long sequence. Evidence of a period when the land stood higher than today survives in a different form. Patches of peat now found below sea level. Peat means vegetation and long-standing wet ground. It cannot form under salt water. So when it is found beneath the sea, it is a sign that the land once stood above the waterline. Among these ancient shorelines, one level stands out as especially important for early human presence. A coastline that now lies about 25 feet above the modern sea. In both Scotland and Ireland, this raised shoreline has produced the earliest secure traces of human activity. That is the Ireland the first settlers would have seen. It was not open farmland and gentle roads. It was a hard country dominated by forests. Great pines covered wide areas, mixed with older stands of oak. Rivers wandered through the trees without restraint, spreading into marshes and bogs. The climate was colder and wetter than it is now. Rain fed the wetlands, and the interior was far more difficult to cross than modern travellers can easily imagine. Animal life was abundant, and some of it was dangerous. Among the most famous creatures of that time was the giant elk, a massive deer whose remains are found across Europe, but appear in remarkable numbers in Ireland. Its antlers could stretch to extraordinary widths, impressive in open terrain, but a burden in dense woodland. For a long time, scholars argued about whether this animal lived alongside humans on the island. Marks on bones were once taken as proof of human cutting, but later it was shown that bone-on-bone friction in disturbed bogs could create similar grooves. Stories circulated about elk herds trapped in stake enclosures, but these claims were never firmly confirmed. A simpler explanation is often enough. Floods, narrow valleys, and treacherous bog ground can trap large animals naturally, one after another, over long periods. Even so, evidence from certain caves suggests the giant elk may indeed have survived into the era of human occupation. Wolves were also part of the landscape, and their importance extends beyond fear. Wolves shaped human behaviour. They helped keep forests impassable, restricted travel, and likely influenced where people chose to settle and how they defended themselves. Some earthworks and enclosed sites, later interpreted as military forts, may have served, at least in part, as protection against predators. Wolves remained a problem in Ireland for centuries, long after written records began, and their slow disappearance belongs to the later story of the island. Wild boar were plentiful too, and they remained a valued target for hunters far into historical times. Their bones and tusks appear repeatedly in old settlement sites, showing that they were both food and a challenge. Later legends preserve the memory of boar hunts, not because the animal was rare, but because it was fierce and dangerous, the sort of quarry that could define a warrior's reputation. Bears were present as well, though probably not in large numbers. Their bones and teeth have been recovered from several sites, and even shaped into simple objects, suggesting that people encountered them and made use of their remains. Many smaller animals and birds could be listed, but the most important point is clear. Ireland was not a gentle refuge waiting to be claimed. It was a wild landscape filled with obstacles and predators, and the first arrivals would have faced it with the simplest equipment imaginable. That leads naturally to the second question. Where did these people come from, and how did they reach Ireland? The most plausible answer points toward the northeast. The earliest traces cluster in that corner of the island, and that corner is the closest point to other lands. The channel separating northeastern Ireland from western Scotland is narrow enough that in clear weather, the coastline can be seen across the water. This makes the route not only possible, but likely. For a long time, older archaeology talked about a mysterious gap in human development, an apparent leap from Ice Age hunters to settled farming communities, with nothing in between. It looked as if one world ended and another began overnight. But that gap was not real history. It was missing evidence. Once cave sites on the continent were excavated carefully, layers began to reveal the missing middle. Tools and habits emerged that did not fit neatly into either side. The weapon shapes shifted. Materials changed. Hunting patterns altered as certain animals declined and others became dominant. Even the art of earlier periods, once vivid and detailed, faded into simple marks. The transition was not a clean break. It was a long, uneven transformation, influenced both by gradual adaptation and by the arrival of new groups carrying new practices. Along the coasts of northern Europe, another shoreline story unfolds. Shell mounds and shore camps show communities living as fishers, hunters, and foragers. They did not farm. They relied on the sea and the shore. They decorated themselves, sewed hides, and made tools from bone and stone. Even without advanced woodworking tools, they still crossed water. Remains of deep-sea crabs in coastal heaps suggest people were not limited to shallow water. They could travel out, place traps, and return. That fact matters because once small boats can cover several miles at sea, the crossing into Ireland becomes realistic. Still, it is important not to force a simple one-to-one connection. Early coastal settlements in Scotland and early finds in Ireland do not always match perfectly in tool style. Different coastal groups can exist at the same time, separated by only short distances, practicing different methods. Yet geography and timing still strongly suggest Ireland was reached from Scotland during this broader period of shoreline settlement. At the same time, wider pressures may have been shaping movement across Europe. New groups were arriving on the continent, bringing different skills and ideas, and even if their spread was slow and non-violent, it would have changed the balance. Early hunter societies relied on large territories. When population increases, hunting land becomes crowded. That kind of pressure forces movement. It pushes people outward into places that were previously avoided. Further north, into harsher forests, and across water into islands that offer distance and space. There is also a human factor that is easy to overlook. Leaving home was not only physically dangerous, it was emotionally terrifying. For people who lived in a world filled with spiritual fears, every unfamiliar coastline would have felt haunted by unknown forces. Staying at home meant knowing the rituals, the taboos, the ways of appeasing what was believed to live in the land. Stepping into a foreign country meant stepping into a spiritual wilderness. In that mindset, migration does not happen casually. It requires real pressure. It requires necessity. However they arrived, the first settlers appear to have hugged the coast. The interior was still forest-heavy, wet, and dangerous. Life on the shoreline offered food, visibility, and easier movement. This is one reason shell mounds and coastal waste heaps form a rough ring around the island. Yet these heaps do not all belong to the earlier settlers. Some are much later and even contain objects from bronze and iron-using periods. A basic rule applies. If a deposit contains metal objects and there is no reason to suspect contamination, the site cannot be older than those objects. This is why careful layering matters. When sites are disturbed by treasure hunters or careless digging, the story becomes harder to read. By this stage, the third question has already begun to answer itself. The earlier settlers, at least those linked to the raised shoreline level, were working with stone tools. Their life was coastal and practical. Their technology was not the polished farming toolkit of later ages. It was earlier than that, rougher, and shaped by the immediate demands of survival. To push the picture further, shoreline sites can be grouped into several broad types. Some belong to the raised ancient beaches. Others belong to later sandhill camps, closer to the modern shore. Some appear to be places where tools were produced in quantity. Others are mostly food waste heaps, with little tool evidence. Each type points to a different moment and a different way of life. A key example comes from the northeast, where layered gravels once stood along an ancient shoreline and later became valuable as building material. In the modern era, much of that gravel was removed, but a carefully cut section was preserved, allowing the layers to be studied. The site sits above an older post-glacial deposit and below the topsoil that later farming disturbed. That layering matters because it sets the limits of time. Tools found in these gravels cannot belong to an Ice Age human population if the gravels formed after the ice had already withdrawn. Within the layers, tools appear unevenly. In the deepest workable layers, there are almost none. Higher up, a few flakes appear. Above that, more and more pieces show up, including cores and occasional finished forms. Then, there are bands where tools become rare again, followed by a level where they suddenly appear in dense numbers. This pattern suggests a settlement that began small and grew. It also suggests interruptions, perhaps moments when water conditions changed and the area was temporarily flooded or reshaped before people returned. One interpretation argues that the site was not a living place at all, but a workshop where people came to rough out stone and carry it away. Yet the tool style found there is surprisingly consistent, even when the pieces are crude. If it were merely a workshop visited by many groups over time, the debris would likely show more randomness and a broader variety of incomplete experiments. The absence of obvious living debris like ash and shell waste is a real point, but it is not decisive. Such material could exist elsewhere on the site, could have been destroyed, or could have been carried away by shifting water and erosion. Some everyday tools could also have been made of wood or organic material that simply did not survive. Other traces of this raised shoreline settlement phase have been found nearby in the same region, reinforcing the idea that this was not an isolated event, but part of a wider pattern along the northeast coast. And then comes the most frustrating part: a gap. Between the raised shoreline settlements and the later sandhill camps, there is a missing stretch of evidence. It is not necessarily a real break in human development. It is a break in what has been found so far. Nothing has yet been discovered that clearly shows how the earlier stoneworking coastal groups connect to the later and more recognisably Neolithic communities. The idea of a continuous population does not mean that life in early Ireland unfolded in a smooth or uninterrupted line of progress. From a modern point of view, shaped by railways, roads, and engines, it is difficult to imagine how ideas could travel at all in a world without wheeled transport or written communication. Yet the archaeological record makes one thing clear: contact between distant communities was not rare. Even in a time when movement over land relied on narrow tracks worn by animals, and travel by water depended on fragile hide-covered boats, knowledge still crossed borders and seas. Across prehistoric Europe, tools and techniques appear with striking consistency. This suggests that communities were not isolated. Someone, somewhere, was the first to shape a barbed arrowhead, or invent a new way of working stone. Yet that idea spread far beyond its place of origin. Whether the invention was copied from neighbour to neighbour, or rediscovered independently, many times hardly changes the central point. In a world without writing and with immense obstacles to travel, the spread of shared technology remains remarkable. Ireland, despite its position beyond the sea, was not cut off from this exchange. If early settlers could reach the island in the first place, later arrivals could follow. Each new group may have carried with it updated skills, new methods, and different traditions. Over time, these influences reshaped life along the coast and gradually inland. The most convincing explanation for the archaeological pattern seen in Ireland begins with the earliest settlers arriving while still using simple stone technology associated with the Campignan tradition. These first groups appear to have remained concentrated in the northeastern region, close to reliable sources of flint. For a long period, their way of life seems to have changed little. Meanwhile, communities across the water developed more advanced techniques, aided by their closer ties to mainland Europe. Eventually, later groups reached Ireland, bringing with them improved tools and broader knowledge. These newcomers left traces in the older sandhill settlements. This explanation cannot be proven with absolute certainty, but it aligns closely with the evidence currently available. The coastal settlements known as sandhill sites are especially common along the northern shoreline of Ireland, with smaller numbers elsewhere. By the time these communities formed, the land had reached roughly its modern sea level. The inhabitants built simple stone shelters among the dunes and discarded the remains of their meals nearby. Flint tools were preferred where flint was available, but where it was scarce, whatever stone lay at hand was pressed into service. One of the best-known locations of this type lies at White Park Bay, near the eastern end of the Giant's Causeway. For generations, the shifting sands of this area revealed ancient objects, attracting collectors and visitors who removed many of its remains. Wind erosion still exposes deep hollows in the dunes, sometimes reaching astonishing depths. Along the sides of these hollows runs a dark band of soil. This layer marks the ancient ground surface where people once lived. It is dense, compact, and rich in charcoal, ash, broken tools, pottery fragments, and animal remains. Fireplaces can often be identified by rings of flat stones, blackened by repeated use. Ash and burnt material stain the surrounding soil, creating the dark colour that defines these ancient living surfaces. When storms strip away the loose sand above, the objects once resting on this surface fall downward and gather at the bottom of the hollow, preserving them in concentrated clusters. Excavations at White Park Bay revealed a dense scatter of tools and debris within a small area. Rough arrowheads, scrapers, hammerstones, flakes, pottery fragments, pieces of red pigment, worked bone, and animal remains were all found together. Such finds offer a vivid glimpse into daily life along the prehistoric shore. Although these sandhill sites belong primarily to the Stone Age, caution is required. The absence of metal does not automatically indicate great antiquity. Simple stone tools can remain practical long after metal becomes available, especially for tasks like collecting shellfish. Some pottery recovered from these sites resembles forms from much later periods. Each location must be judged carefully, with close attention to layering and context. The materials used in these settlements always reflect the local landscape. Where flint was plentiful, tools show careful workmanship. Along the western coast, where flint is rare, tools are often crude and difficult to recognize as intentional objects unless their forms are already familiar. This variation highlights how strongly geography shaped daily life. Animal bones scattered among the shells show that coastal communities hunted and trapped a wide range of creatures, including cattle, deer, pigs, wolves, foxes, goats, and sheep. Large bones were routinely split to extract marrow. Bird remains show that seabirds were also part of the diet. Fish bones are rarely preserved, but this likely reflects poor survival rather than absence from meals. Shellfish clearly formed a major food source. Huge quantities of oysters, mussels, cockles, periwinkles, scallops, and whelks appear across many sites. In some cases, shells belong to species no longer found in the surrounding waters. This hints at environmental change over time. The dog whelk appears frequently, and although later writers speculated about dye production, the physical evidence tells a simpler story. The shells are crushed rather than pierced, which would destroy any dye. These mollusks were eaten, not harvested for colour. The sheer practicality of prehistoric diets should not be underestimated. Shells are often grouped by species, suggesting that large quantities were collected and consumed at once. These gatherings likely marked communal feasts, rather than casual meals. Over time, coastal groups began moving inland along rivers, which served as natural highways. Evidence from riverbank sites shows layers of occupation stacked above older coastal remains. This gradual expansion reflects growing familiarity with the landscape. Certain sites show no signs of long-term living at all. These are factory sites, places where stone tools were made but not used. They lack hearths, food remains, and shelters. Instead, they contain large numbers of partially shaped tools, waste flakes, and hammerstones. Such locations reveal how tools were produced and how raw material was worked. In some valleys of Northern Ireland, thousands of stone axes were collected from such manufacturing areas. Similar sites exist elsewhere, confirming that tool production could be concentrated in specific locations. Another type of coastal site consists almost entirely of shells. These heaps lack dwellings, tools, or permanent structures. They appear to be collection points rather than settlements. In some cases, they may even be relatively recent, formed by people gathering shellfish for sale. By the end of the Stone Age, humans had spread across the entire island. Large stone monuments and burial structures confirm their presence inland, though everyday living sites remain poorly documented. Cave sites offer rare opportunities to observe long sequences of occupation. One cave on the southern coast reveals a layered history shaped by water and animals and people. Over time, it served as shelter for bears, then humans. Charcoal layers, broken animal bones, simple tools, and human remains appear gradually. The remains show that people hunted large animals, processed carcasses elsewhere, and carried selected portions back to the cave. The presence of human and extinct animal remains together, confirms that they lived at the same time. Later, layers contain polished stone tools and pottery, marking the final phase of Stone Age life before abandonment. Such carefully excavated sites demonstrate why context matters more than objects themselves. Without careful recording, the story of a site is lost forever. Poor excavation destroys evidence just as surely as time. Stone tools dominate the material record of this era. Flint, where available, was ideal. In northeastern Ireland, chalk cliffs protected by basalt preserved enormous quantities of flint nodules. Elsewhere, people relied on chert and other stones, even when these materials were difficult to work. Tool shapes remained similar, showing that traditions travelled even when materials changed. As skills developed, tools became more refined and specialised. Early tools served many purposes. Later ones were designed for specific tasks. This shift reflects a growing complexity in daily life. Three broad phases can be recognised: an early coastal phase linked to raised beaches, a later sandhill phase marked by settled shoreline life, and a final stage overlapping with the early use of metal. The earliest tools are simple. Cores, flakes, and blunt stone picks dominate. These tools match those found in parts of continental Europe, linking Ireland to wider cultural networks. Later, coastal sites show a greater variety of tools. Flakes were shaped into knives, scrapers, drills, and cutting implements. Some were mounted on wooden shafts, traces of which rarely survive. Scrapers are especially common, likely used to process animal skins. Arrowheads and javelin points show increasing precision and skill. Some unfinished examples reveal the steps of manufacture frozen in time. Hammerstones and flat anvil stones reveal how tools were made. Small punch-like tools were used to refine edges with careful pressure. Larger handheld choppers served heavy tasks. Bone tools also appear, including pins, awls, and needles. These objects suggest clothing, repair work, and personal ornamentation. Drilling tools used during the later Stone Age were made in a surprisingly clever way. To bore holes into stone or bone, people used hollow sections taken from the long bones of animals. These bone tubes were rotated using a simple bow-driven mechanism. As the drill spun, sand and water were added to the surface being worked. Over time, the constant motion and abrasion slowly wore a hole into the material. This process required patience rather than force, but it was highly effective. At several coastal sites, antler tines have also been found. These were likely used as scoops, perhaps for handling hot material, ash, or loose soil. At White Park Bay, archaeologists uncovered sections of horn pierced through the centre, shaped to act as hammers. These objects show that people were already adapting organic materials for specialised tasks. Pottery recovered from sandhill settlements belongs to a separate discussion and is better considered on its own, as it represents a distinct craft tradition. When it comes to clothing and personal adornment, the evidence is limited. No clear proof exists for spinning tools from pure Neolithic contexts in Ireland. This suggests that although spinning was known elsewhere during this period, it may not yet have been practiced locally. Instead, people likely continued to rely on animal skins for clothing. At White Park Bay, lumps of mineral pigments such as ochre and iron-rich earth were discovered. These substances may have been used as body paint, possibly for decoration or ritual display. At Port Stewart, small beads made of green stone were found. They are button-sized, rounded in form, and hollowed on one side, indicating they were worn as ornaments. As the Stone Age drew to a close, a clear improvement in stoneworking skill becomes visible. Earlier tools were shaped with a small number of strong blows, but later examples show careful, deliberate flaking to achieve symmetry. Some of these tools display remarkable patience and control. Although Irish flint work does not quite match the finest examples from Scandinavia or Egypt, the best local pieces come close to that level of craftsmanship. At this stage, a new technique appears. Instead of leaving tools rough-flaked, people began smoothing the stone surface by grinding and polishing it. This development is best seen in the stone axe, often called a celt. These axes were shaped with a sharp cutting edge at one end and a blunted tail at the other. They were designed to be fitted into wooden handles. A small number of such axes have been found still attached to their original hafts, preserved in bogs where the wood survived. In one case, traces of a dark, resin-like substance were found around the socket, likely used to strengthen the grip between stone and wood. Some polished axes were discovered with holes partly drilled through their sides. These holes may have held wooden pegs that passed through the handle, preventing the blade from slipping free. Early axes were often only chipped into shape, with polishing occurring naturally along the cutting edge through repeated use. It may have been this accidental shine that inspired people to polish entire tools deliberately. Over time, grinding became more thorough, producing smooth surfaces across the whole axe. When particularly fine stone was used, such as serpentine, the result could be visually striking. Some axes are so finely polished that they appear more like works of art than practical tools. Their fragile edges and glossy surfaces would not survive heavy labour. These pieces were likely ceremonial, comparable to elaborately decorated axes known from other parts of the world, which were symbolic rather than functional. Stone axes vary greatly in size. A few reach exceptional lengths, but most fall within a moderate range. Very small examples are also common. Differences in the shape of the blunt end have been observed. Some axes taper to a point, while others end in a rounded or squared form. Evidence suggests that both styles were used at the same time, though the pointed form may be slightly earlier. More discoveries will be needed to clarify this. As stone tools overlapped with early metal tools, shapes began to influence one another. Stone tools are naturally convex, while metal tools tend to be flat. During the transition period, craftspeople sometimes copied the shape of one material into the other. Flat stone axes exist, though they are rare and are best understood as imitations of early metal forms. Occasionally, shale objects resembling axes or swords have been found in burial contexts. While these are sometimes described as symbolic or ceremonial tools, there is reason to doubt whether they were intentionally shaped at all. Some may simply be naturally formed stones mistaken for artifacts. Heavy tools such as mallets, mauls, and hammer axes form another group. Mallets are rounded stones drilled through the centre to accept a handle. Mauls are larger and lack holes. Instead, they have grooves cut around them so they could be tied securely to a handle with rope. Hammer axes resemble modern axe heads with a cutting edge on one side and a blunt striking surface on the other. Some have two cutting edges. Their carefully shaped form shows a high level of planning and effort, especially considering the labour required to drill through solid stone. One remarkable double-headed axe was discovered in County Carlow. Made of polished stone, it has cutting edges at both ends and an unusually small haft hole. This hole would not have supported heavy use, and the fine polish would have been quickly damaged if the tool were used in work. Like other ceremonial axes known worldwide, it was almost certainly symbolic rather than practical. It is important to understand that not all stone tools belong strictly to the Stone Age. Many types, especially arrowheads and cutting tools, continued to be used long after metal became available. Flint, though limited in distribution, was cheaper than bronze, which required imported tin. For weapons that could be lost easily, stone remained practical. This explains why bronze arrowheads are absent in Ireland. Stone tools were made from whatever hard material was available locally. Flint was ideal, but not always accessible. Basalt, sandstone, and quartzite were commonly used instead. Claims that Ireland lacked a true Neolithic period do not withstand scrutiny. The development of stone tools follows the same pattern seen across Europe. Once metal became established, older stoneworking skills gradually disappeared, and there was no return to earlier methods. Some have suggested that flint arrowheads, from coastal sites, might date to the Norman period, but this idea does not hold up. Written sources tell us nothing about pre-Celtic life, and there is no evidence that Norman archers used flint-tipped arrows. The silence of texts points to great antiquity, not lateness. Polished stone axes sometimes appear alongside much later objects, but this reflects their continued symbolic value. These tools were believed to hold supernatural power and were kept as protection against lightning. Grinding stones and querns also appear frequently. Simple rubbing stones were used to crush grain or other materials by hand. Over time, these developed into saddle-shaped querns, consisting of a large lower stone and a smaller upper stone that was rubbed back and forth. The arrival of metal did not bring an immediate end to stone tools as might be expected. Instead, it pushed stone workers to new levels of precision. Faced with metal weapons that were smoother and more refined, craftsmen working in flint and stone responded by improving their own techniques. They produced tools with sharper edges, finer surfaces, and an increasingly high polish, attempting to match the quality of objects made from the new material. Metal remained scarce for a long time. Even toward the end of the Bronze Age, broken tools and scrap pieces were carefully collected and melted down for reuse. One such cache of metal waste was discovered in County Roscommon. It contained fragments of objects whose complete forms are otherwise unknown in Ireland. The nature of the pieces shows that the horde belonged to the very late Bronze Age. An even later deposit was uncovered at Ansborough in County Armagh. This group included a broken bronze neck ring, a pulse-stave, and 2 plain bracelets. On their own, these items could belong to an earlier phase, but among them was also a brooch of Roman provincial type, dating no earlier than the 1st century before the Common Era. This confirms that stone and metal traditions overlapped far longer than might be assumed. Stone still had one clear advantage: it was cheap and readily available. But a roughly chipped stone tool felt crude when compared to the smooth surface of metal. This contrast explains why the later stone tools show such careful polishing. The influence of metal craftsmanship on stoneworking is clearly visible during this overlap period. The finest flint daggers ever produced in Europe, particularly those from Scandinavia, appear to be direct attempts to rival copper blades. In Ireland and elsewhere, flat stone axes occasionally appear that clearly imitate shapes originally developed in metal. This ambition to compete with metal, rather than metal's practical superiority alone, ultimately exhausted the stone industry. Stone was harder than pure copper and held an edge better, but copying metal shapes in stone demanded enormous effort. In the end, stone workers could not match the speed and efficiency of casting tools in moulds, and the craft faded away. During the Copper Age, finely polished stone weapons reached their peak. Among them, the hammer axe stands out as the most powerful weapon available to warriors of the time. Its effectiveness came from its sheer weight and mass, qualities impossible to achieve in metal without wasting large amounts of material. For this reason, these weapons were always made from heavy blocks of stone. Alongside stone weapons, a new metal blade appeared in this period: the triangular dagger without a tang. This weapon closely followed the form of earlier flint daggers. Its blade was inserted into a handle of wood, bone, or horn and secured with rivets. Over time, repeated sharpening altered the blade's original straight edges, making them appear slightly curved inward. This concave shape was sometimes copied in stone arrowheads, many of which likely date to the Bronze Age as well. The next phase of development began when people learned how to mix copper with tin to produce bronze. Tin, once thought useless, suddenly became essential, and trade networks expanded rapidly. For Northern Europe, Cornwall became a key source. Ireland exchanged its gold for bronze or tin processed elsewhere. The large number of Irish bronze tools and weapons preserved today reflects the intensity of this trade. Earlier, theories imagined Mediterranean traders bringing their culture directly to the Atlantic islands. These ideas arose from misunderstandings of how ancient trade actually worked. Long-distance exchange did not rely on direct journeys from one end of Europe to the other. Instead, goods moved gradually, passing from one group to another along river valleys and land routes. Along with metal and amber, stories, skills, and ideas travelled the same paths, quietly shaping shared traditions across the continent. By the second phase of the Bronze Age, stone tools largely disappear from everyday use. Only items especially suited to stone, such as arrowheads, javelin points, simple hammers, and occasional flint knives, continue to appear. Stone could no longer compete with the ease of producing metal tools. One exception was the archer's wrist guard, usually made of polished stone, designed to protect the arm from the snap of the bowstring. Flat axes continued to exist, but the dominant form now became the flanged axe. These were more carefully made, showing the growing confidence of metalworkers. For the first time, decoration appeared. Craftsmen discovered that bronze could be marked with engraved lines, punched patterns, and textured hammering. The outer faces of flanges were sometimes shaped into rope-like designs or small pyramids, turning functional tools into objects of visual appeal. A raised ridge across the blade prevented the axe from being driven too deeply into its handle. As these features proved useful, they gradually became larger and more pronounced. The triangular dagger continued to be used, suited for close combat. At this stage, there were still no bronze spearheads. Long-range fighting relied on stone-tipped weapons. Yet the desire to strike from beyond arm's reach led to a new invention. By fixing a dagger blade sideways onto a long handle, people created the halberd. This weapon replaced the blunt stone hammer axe with a sharp cutting edge. The halberd spread across parts of Europe and became especially important in Ireland. While continental examples remained modest in size, Irish blades grew longer and developed a distinctive curved profile, easily recognisable wherever they are found. Most Irish halberds were made of nearly pure copper, likely because bronze was too valuable to be used in such large quantities. Finds combining lightly flanged axes and halberds confirm that these weapons belong to the early bronze-using phase. Gold ornamentation also flourished during this time. The most distinctive object of this period is the crescent-shaped gold collar. Thin sheets of gold were cut into curved forms with flattened terminals at the ends. These collars were decorated with fine engraved lines concentrated near the ends, leaving the center plane. This unusual pattern suggests that the design developed from earlier necklaces made of beads or chains. The collars were secured with cords and worn around the neck. These gold ornaments are found throughout Ireland, but rarely elsewhere, except in regions easily reached by sea. This distribution shows that Ireland was the main centre of their production and spread. As bronze casting advanced, the palstave replaced earlier axe forms. These tools sometimes included side loops to tie them securely to handles. At the same time, Dagger blades grew longer and narrower, evolving into more effective thrusting weapons. Some handles were made of bronze, though most were organic and rarely survive. A new dagger form with a projecting tang also appeared. Over time, this design led to the socketed spearhead. By merging the blade and its reinforcing collar into a single cast piece, craftsmen created a weapon that could be fitted either to a short handle as a dagger or to a long shaft as a spear. These developments required more complex casting techniques. Stone moulds were carved in two halves, carefully aligned to form a complete shape. Molten bronze was poured in through a channel and allowed to cool. For socketed tools, clay cores were used to shape the hollow interior. After casting, the clay was removed, leaving a clean socket ready for hafting. Gold ornamentation changed as well. The crescent collar disappeared and was replaced by twisted neck rings. These were made by twisting bars or strips of metal into spiral forms, then bending them into loops with hooked ends. Some were made of bronze, others of gold. Larger examples may have been ceremonial or votive offerings rather than everyday ornaments. One remarkable discovery, known today by a convenient name, revealed miniature gold axe models, a small shield, pins, rings, and other ornaments. Though much of the original find was lost or forged by middlemen seeking profit, the surviving objects show deep symbolic meaning. The tiny axe models were likely amulets, echoing ancient beliefs in the sacred power of the weapon. The shield model preserves features seen later in full-size shields, including deliberate breaks in symmetry that recall earlier observation openings. As the Bronze Age advanced, socketed axes and spearheads became standard. Spears gained decorative ribs and openings in their blades, remnants of earlier attachment methods. Rivets replaced cords for securing heads to shafts. Rapiers vanished, replaced by swords capable of both thrusting and cutting. Bronze swords became longer and more refined, often protected by leather scabbards tipped with metal. Metalworking expanded beyond weapons. Razors, chisels, gouges, goldsmiths' tools, sickles and ornaments appear in abundance. Shields of bronze, wood, and leather survive, decorated with concentric patterns that preserve traces of earlier functional designs. Long ornamental pins, finely made garments, and complex gold objects testify to a society of growing specialization. Among the most mysterious gold forms are cupped rings, bent bars ending in hollow terminals. Some may have served as ornaments, others as fasteners, and some perhaps as a form of weighed wealth. Their varied sizes suggest a standardized system of value rather than simple decoration. Detailed study of their manufacture reveals extraordinary technical skill. Gold was melted in charcoal fires, shaped with moulds and swages, assembled from multiple parts, and decorated with precision tools. The range of equipment required shows that Bronze Age craftsmen were not improvisers, but highly trained specialists. In March of 1854, railway construction between Limerick and Ennis cut through the landscape of County Clare. As workers dismantled a small stone mound, they uncovered one of the most remarkable collections of prehistoric gold ever found in Western Europe. Hidden at the centre of the cairn was a vast hoard of gold objects, many of them belonging to a distinctive class of ornaments already known from earlier discoveries. The find was located near a large fortified enclosure whose original name has been lost to time. 18th century records refer to it as Aonghasa, a name that likely reflects an earlier Irish form. Today, the site is known as Moane. It has long been suggested that the gold was plunder taken from this stronghold, buried in haste by raiders who never returned to reclaim it. When the hoard was discovered, there was no organised excavation and no protection of the site. The result was chaos. A frantic scramble followed, and most of the objects were quickly sold and melted down. Only a fraction was rescued and eventually preserved in museum collections. The loss was enormous. No other discovery of prehistoric gold in Western Europe has matched this one in scale, and the destruction of so much material represents a permanent loss to historical knowledge. Even the surviving portion was extraordinary. Records indicate that at least 150 objects were originally present. Of these, only a small number remain today. The majority were simple gold rings of the cupped type, mostly small and nearly identical in form. Their uniformity strongly supports the idea that they served as standardized objects of exchange rather than personal ornaments. These rings dominate the horde, but they were not the only gold items produced during this period. Among the most striking ornaments of the Late Bronze Age are the gorgets. These large crescent-shaped objects were worn across the chest and recall earlier lunulae in outline, yet they differ in nearly every technical detail. Gorgets are larger, heavier, and curved rather than flat. Their decoration is raised rather than engraved and covers the entire surface instead of being confined to selected areas. Unlike lunulae, whose terminal discs were part of the same piece of metal, the circular ends of gorgets were made separately and attached afterward. These discs are often richly decorated with concentric patterns, dots, and raised ridges. In at least one case, traces of original wool thread wrapped with gold wire still survive, preserving a rare glimpse into Bronze Age textile work. Another form of gorget appears as a hybrid between the crescent ornament and the cupped ring. In these examples, the central band is formed from a thin gold disc bent into a curve, terminating in small cup-shaped ends. The resemblance to the cupped ring is unmistakable, suggesting a shared symbolic or functional origin. Large hollow gold spheres also belong to this phase of ornamentation. Found along the River Shannon in the 19th century, these objects were constructed from two thin hemispheres joined together. Their size and weight make it unlikely they were worn by people. Instead, they were probably used to decorate horses, adding visual impact and prestige during ceremonial displays. Thin gold discs are another important group. These objects were often engraved or stamped with geometric patterns such as concentric circles or cross-like designs. Small perforations suggest they were sewn onto garments, possibly reinforcing openings or serving as protective ornaments. Some scholars have proposed that certain discs were mounted on wheeled ceremonial objects connected to solar symbolism, similar to examples found in Scandinavia. Unfortunately, the way most gold objects were discovered has left many questions unanswered. Finds were usually made accidentally by labourers digging turf or ploughing fields. Objects were often removed without record, and any context was lost. As a result, it remains unclear how these ornaments were worn or who wore them. Whether they adorned men, women, or both cannot be stated with certainty. There are rare exceptions. In one burial discovered in County Cork in the early 19th century, a human skeleton was found, partially covered with thin gold plates connected by wire, along with amber beads. Much of the gold was quickly melted down, but enough survived to show that elaborate gold decoration could accompany the dead. Another burial from the same region reportedly contained a large gold sheet covering the upper body, along with a piece of gold ring ornament. These discoveries suggest that gold discs and large gorgets were sometimes worn in death, possibly as symbols of status, protection, or belief. Gold beads also appear frequently. Some are small and delicate, others large and heavy. Certain examples include slots cut into their sides, indicating complex methods of attachment. Small twisted rings of gold also occur, likely serving as earrings, finger rings, or hair ornaments. Gold vessels are extremely rare, but they did exist. The best-known example was found in County Tipperary in the 17th century. For centuries it was mistakenly described as a crown, though it was in fact a finely worked bowl decorated with raised patterns similar to those seen on gorgets. Gold ornaments were sometimes stored carefully when not in use. Wooden boxes carved to fit specific shapes have survived in a few cases, preserving the negative impression of torques and rings. These containers show that such objects were valued, protected, and likely passed down over generations. Gold was not the only exotic material used during the later Bronze Age. Amber and jet also appear in Irish finds, even though neither occurs naturally in Ireland in workable quantities. Amber beads, typically flattened ovals pierced through the short axis, point to trade connections with the Baltic region. Jet ornaments likely came from Britain, particularly from areas where jet sources were well known. Amber beads are often found singly or in groups, suggesting necklaces whose strings have decayed. Their association with gold-cupped rings and bronze tools places them firmly in the late Bronze Age. Jet ornaments show greater variety, including buttons, armlets, and beads of many shapes. Some are surprisingly large and may have been intended for animal decoration rather than human use. One jet necklace discovered in a burial in County Meath included a triangular pendant that clearly functioned as an amulet. Its placement shows intentional design and symbolic meaning. Establishing a precise timeline for these developments is impossible. By definition, prehistory lacks written dates. However, approximate boundaries can be suggested. The Bronze Age in Ireland ended with the arrival of iron-using groups, likely between 400 and 100 BCE. This transition was probably associated with incoming populations, rather than gradual local development. The beginning of the Bronze Age in Ireland may be placed around 2500 BCE, allowing time for copper technology to spread westward across Europe. Dividing the period into 5 phases gives a rough framework spanning just over 2 millennia. Beyond the Bronze Age lies the Stone Age, stretching back into deep prehistory. The earliest farming cultures in Europe emerged after the final retreat of the glaciers, around 7000 BCE. Even earlier traditions may reach back to 10,000 BCE or more. At such distances, uncertainty is unavoidable. Pottery offers another window into prehistoric life. Stone Age pottery in Ireland is extremely rare, limited to a few fragments from northern sites. These early vessels were round-bottomed bowls decorated with simple punctured patterns. Bronze Age pottery is far more common and shows consistent traits. The clay is coarse and gritty. Vessels were shaped by hand rather than on a wheel, resulting in irregular symmetry. Decoration was applied freehand, often uneven. Firing took place in open fires, producing uneven colouring. Glazes and paints were unknown. All decoration was created directly in the clay. Domestic pottery from coastal settlements is usually fragmentary. Some vessels were wide and shallow, others taller and more cylindrical. Evidence suggests that certain pots were coated with a fine clay slip to reduce porosity. Burn marks on the interior surfaces indicate cooking with heated stones rather than direct fire. Bronze Age burial pottery falls into 4 main groups. Beakers, common in Britain, are almost absent in Ireland. Their absence reflects population history. The people who introduced beaker pottery into Britain did not settle in Ireland. The few Irish examples may have been made by captives brought across the sea. Food vessels, by contrast, are widespread in Ireland. They appear in several shapes and are often richly decorated. Many were later reused as containers for cremated remains. Their ornamentation is entirely geometric, avoiding representations of people or animals. This avoidance may reflect religious beliefs, though the original meanings of the patterns are now lost. Cinerary urns are larger versions of domestic vessels. Their decoration is simpler, usually confined to the upper portion. Construction was less refined, built from layered slabs of clay. Raised rope patterns sometimes appear, a feature rarely seen on food vessels. The smallest and most mysterious vessels are the so-called incense cups. Their purpose is unknown. Some are perforated, others solid. They are often found inside urns or placed among cremated remains. One possibility is that they carried embers from a sacred fire to light the funeral pyre. The carvings found on prehistoric Irish stones were always cut directly into the surface. The artists used three main methods. In some cases, the lines were carefully engraved with a sharp tool. In others, the design was created by striking the stone repeatedly with a pointed implement, either along the outlines of the pattern or across the entire enclosed surface. Sometimes both techniques appear on the same stone. When this happens, it is often clear that the newer work was added later, and that care was taken not to damage the earlier markings. This suggests that certain symbols were regarded as important, perhaps even untouchable. By examining how different designs overlap one another, it becomes possible to establish a relative sequence. The simplest engraved lines appear to be the oldest. These were followed by patterns formed through pocking along the design lines, and finally by broad areas of surface pocking. This gradual change in technique reflects a long tradition rather than a single moment of artistic expression. Only one example of coloured stone decoration is known in Ireland. It was discovered inside a burial monument near Loch Crauoibe. No other painted carvings have survived, suggesting that colour was rarely used, or that it has simply not endured. The way these carvings are arranged is striking. The symbols are scattered across the stone without any obvious plan. They repeat endlessly, using a small number of shapes over and over again. This lack of overall composition suggests that the carvings were not intended as decoration in the usual sense. Bronze Age artists clearly understood symmetry and rhythm. This can be seen instantly on decorated pottery or engraved gold objects, where every element fits into a carefully planned design. Stone carvings, however, follow a different logic. Even when an entire surface is covered, there is no unified scheme. Each symbol seems to stand alone, unrelated to those beside it. Both straight and curved forms appear in the carvings, but they are handled very differently from similar shapes in metal or clay. Repeated triangles, lozenges, or spirals do not merge into larger patterns. Instead, they appear as many individual repetitions of the same sign. Some symbols found on stone never appear in metalwork or pottery at all. Most notably, stone carvings sometimes include human or animal forms, something generally avoided in other Bronze Age art. The symbols used in these carvings form a limited visual vocabulary. Straight lines are rare. Zigzags appear frequently, sometimes arranged like herringbone patterns. Triangles, trapezoids, and diamond shapes are common. Some diamonds are plain, while others are divided by internal lines or framed by an outer shape, with the surrounding surface often pocked away. Cross-like forms also appear. Curved symbols are even more prominent. These include cup-shaped hollows, spirals, concentric circles, and circles cut by a single radial groove. Some circles are marked with radiating lines, others appear only as partial arcs. Alongside these are many irregular or compound figures that resist easy classification. In a few cases, shapes clearly resemble faces or animals. Ireland contains many examples of such carvings, far too many to describe in full. One of the most remarkable is a large stone slab at Clúain Fionn Locha. Although it does not belong fully to the Bronze Age tradition, it is crucial for understanding earlier symbolism. The slab is covered with cup marks, foot-shaped impressions, cross-like figures, and vertical lines topped with circles or knobs. These shapes closely resemble very early carvings, found in parts of southern Europe. The vertical figures with knobs appear to represent stylized human forms, with raised arms bent at the elbows. Some seem to carry tools or weapons. The cross-shaped figures may also represent people, perhaps members of a different group. Notably, the two types of figures are separated on different sides of the stone. Footprints are concentrated on one side as well. This arrangement suggests that the slab may record a conflict between two opposing groups, frozen in symbolic form. The scattered cup marks among one group of figures may even represent fallen enemies. Whatever the precise meaning, the parallels with continental carvings imply direct contact between Ireland and southern Europe at a very early date. Another major concentration of carvings is found in burial monuments near Loch Crauipe. Here, spirals, zigzags, circles, and complex combinations cover many stones. Similar symbolism appears in the Great Burial Complex at Brú na Bóinne. Inside the stone chambers and along the surrounding curbstones, spirals and concentric patterns dominate. These carvings were clearly integral to the meaning of the monument, not later additions. Further north, carved stones line burial chambers at several sites. Some show single cup marks, others display elaborate spirals or concentric designs. One stone includes a labyrinth-like form unlike anything else in Ireland. Nearby stands a carved stone in an open field, divided by a diagonal line of cup marks with symbols spread across both sides. The placement appears intentional rather than decorative. At another site, a burial chamber reveals carvings that include a clear human face emerging from the stone. In County Sligo, a similar monument shows carvings that resemble later artistic styles, suggesting it may belong to the final phase of this tradition. One stone there appears to depict a female figure. Scattered across the landscape are many rocks bearing cup and circle carvings, similar to those found throughout northern Europe. A standing stone in County Wexford is particularly notable. One face bears 3 cup marks arranged, like a face. Another side carries traces of later writing, now destroyed. This stone appears to have served 3 different roles over time. First as a sacred image, later as a memorial marker, and finally as an object altered during the early Christian period. The survival of the cup mark shows that their meaning had already been forgotten by the time later changes were made. The repeated appearance of faces, human figures, and animals links these carvings to burial practices. Similar figures appear in prehistoric sites across Europe, often associated with the dead. These images likely represent a deity connected with death or the afterlife. In several Irish burial monuments, plain pillar stones stand in place of carved figures. These may represent the same presence in abstract form. Where a female figure appears, it suggests that this deity may have been imagined as a goddess. Other symbols are harder to interpret. Cup and circle carvings appear across the world, from Europe to the Americas and the Pacific. Similar designs are used by indigenous communities in ritual contexts, where their meanings are highly specific and impossible to understand without insider knowledge. This makes interpretation dangerous. Still, some cautious suggestions can be made. Triangles and trapezoids resemble the shape of early axe heads. In other regions, unmistakable axe carvings appear in stone art, making this association plausible. The axe was closely linked with the thunder deity. which may explain the presence of zigzags as symbols of lightning or storms. Diamond shapes may represent ritual instruments used in ceremonies. Certain circular designs resemble labyrinths, known from the Mediterranean world, and may symbolize ritual movement or dance. Some complex designs appear to combine several ideas into one image. Others may represent celestial bodies, flowing light, or ritual spaces. Yet similar symbols in other cultures can mean wells, trees, women, or places of origin. This suggests that Bronze Age symbolism may not have been fixed or universal. One particularly compelling idea is that paired spirals represent eyes. These pairs are common in burial chambers. In the dim interior of a tomb, such shapes could give the impression of watching eyes, warning intruders that the dead were guarded. While spirals and circles may be related, they rarely appear together in Ireland, suggesting different phases of symbolism rather than simple variation. Some monuments emphasize circles, others spirals, without a clear sequence. Several ancient writers describe societies in the Western Islands where marriage did not resemble anything familiar to the classical world. They spoke of shared wives and the absence of exclusive unions. One writer applied this idea to Ireland, another to the Pictish communities of northern Britain, and later authors repeated the claim. These accounts are often dismissed or attacked, yet the problem lies not in dishonesty, but in misunderstanding. The observers who recorded these customs came from societies built on very specific assumptions about family, authority, and inheritance. When confronted with a social system that followed entirely different rules, they lacked both the knowledge and the willingness to understand it. What they saw conflicted with their instincts and expectations. As a result, they described what they could not interpret as disorder and chaos, reducing a structured system to crude labels like promiscuity. Later generations reacted defensively. Embarrassed by these descriptions, they rejected the ancient accounts altogether and accused their authors of invention. This response is just as flawed. Human societies have never followed a single pattern. The system familiar to modern Europe is not the only way communities have organized marriage, descent, and authority. Other systems developed under different conditions. They may appear alien or inferior to later observers, but they were neither random nor lawless. Every comparison with known traditional societies suggests that the pre-Celtic social order was not simple, but highly regulated. A surviving fragment of this system appears in the rules governing succession among the Picts. One striking detail is that many Pictish kings had fathers whose names belonged to foreign cultures. This pattern makes sense only if descent was traced through women, and if marriage required partners to be drawn from outside the group. In such societies, a man could not marry within his own community, even if there was no blood relationship. Marriage was required to cross group boundaries. This rule, known as exogamy, ensured that alliances extended outward rather than inward. Under a system like this, children belonged not to the father's group, but to the mother's. The result was a social logic very different from later European norms. In this arrangement, a man's own children belonged to another group, while his sister's children belonged to his own. Authority followed the same path. Discipline, inheritance, and leadership flowed through maternal connections. In some societies with this structure, a man could not punish his own children without provoking conflict, but he had unquestioned authority over his sister's sons. This framework also explains practices that later writers found shocking or tried to erase. Relationships that would be unthinkable under later systems could be acceptable if the individuals belonged to different groups. Irish genealogies preserve traces of such unions. Later, editors struggled to reinterpret them, unaware that the social rules under which they occurred were simply different. The question then arises of how these groups identified themselves. Modern surnames offer a convenient comparison, but ancient communities used a very different system. Identity was often defined through totems. A totem was not a personal symbol, but a shared identity linking a group to a particular animal, plant, or object. Members of the group believed themselves connected to this symbol by descent or essence. The totem was treated as kin. To harm it was to harm the group itself. Such beliefs govern behaviour, diet, ritual, and marriage. This system appears across the world, among peoples with no historical connection to one another. It shaped rituals, taboos, and myths. Even societies that later abandoned totemism preserved fragments of it in stories and customs whose original meaning was forgotten. In Ireland, traces of this system survive in ancient group names. Some communities identified themselves with animals, others with natural forces, others with objects or parts of animals. These names are not poetic metaphors. They point to a time when group identity was defined by symbolic kinship rather than territory or political rule. Later legends preserve distorted echoes of this worldview. Stories in which people transform into animals, or are born from them, make sense when understood as expressions of group identity rather than literal events. Prohibitions against hunting or harming certain creatures reflect ancient taboos rather than moral lessons. As for how these groups formed and interacted, little can be said with certainty. The earliest settlers likely arrived in small numbers, spreading gradually across the land. Dense forests divided communities and limited contact. Each group developed its own traditions, guided by councils of elders and shaped by shared memory rather than written law. When later cultures arrived, they had little interest in recording the customs of those they displaced. The older population became invisible in official history. What survives does so by accident, through fragments preserved in stories, names, and unusual legal practices. Language offers only faint clues. The speech of the earliest inhabitants was almost completely replaced. What remains survives only in place names, especially those of rivers and mountains. These names resist explanation in later languages. They belong to an older layer of thought, shaped before metal tools and written records. Rivers in particular preserve the deepest memory, while towns and land divisions were renamed by later settlers. Rivers kept their ancient identities. Their names are the oldest surviving expressions of belief, older even than the earliest tools. They reflect a world in which natural forces were alive, sacred, and addressed directly. Some fragments of the old language survived longer in northern Britain than in Ireland. There, traces were written down, though in damaged and fragmentary form. Attempts to interpret them have met with little success. The material is too scarce, too broken, and too distant in time. What can be said is that this language did not belong to the family that later dominated Europe. From all this, a partial picture emerges. The earliest communities were small, scattered, and self-contained. They organised themselves through symbolic kinship, traced descent through women, enforced marriage rules that bound groups together, and understood identity through ritual connection, rather than territory or blood alone. Their world was complex, coherent, and deeply symbolic, even if its logic no longer speaks clearly to later generations. When attention turns to how these people lived and defended themselves, another problem arises. Stone and Bronze Age dwellings are difficult to separate from those of later periods. Excavation offers limited help. Many structures were built directly on bedrock, leaving little behind. Portable objects are rare. What survives is fragmentary and often misleading. One broad distinction can be made between settlements on land, and those built on water. Lake dwellings belong to a later period. They appear only after iron tools became common. These artificial islands were defensive responses to social tension, built by groups who had seized land and needed protection from those they ruled. On land, thousands of ancient structures remain. Most are ruined. Many were destroyed by farming or neglect. Even so, they offer clues. Most early homes were not made of stone. They were built from wood, hide, or textile. These materials vanished long ago. Stone structures survive not because they were better, but because they were poorer and simpler. Early coastal settlers likely lived in light shelters near their food sources. Some sites show nothing more than hearths and refuse. A dark band in the sand marks where people once lived, cooked, and slept in the open. Where stone huts appear, they are usually circular. This shape reflects the tradition of the tent. Walls formed a protective shell. Roofs were likely supported by wood and covered with organic material. Comfort was basic but sufficient. Later, stone construction improved. The corbelled dome, often called the false arch, allowed larger enclosed spaces. This technique appears in burial monuments before it appears in houses. Surviving stone huts are probably later than the Bronze Age, but they preserve methods already known. These huts were not the homes of the wealthy. The elite lived in wooden buildings described vividly in later literature. Those structures are gone. What remains are the modest dwellings of ordinary people. One remarkable Bronze Age settlement survives on a mountain slope in the west. Dozens of circular stone enclosures cluster together. Their walls are thick but low. They were likely windbreaks rather than full houses. Inside them stood lighter structures now vanished. The location was chosen for defense and visibility, not comfort. From individual enclosures, it is only a small step to grouped settlements, surrounded by a shared wall. Contrary to common belief, early Ireland was not entirely without organised communities. While they did not resemble later European towns, they functioned as collective living spaces, shaped by local needs. Large stone forts dominate certain landscapes. Their age is uncertain, but tradition consistently assigns them to the earlier inhabitants. No clear historical memory links them to later rulers. Excavations yield stone tools, but no iron. This absence is telling. One great fort stands on a hill overlooking the sea in the north. It consists of a massive circular wall with interior passages and multiple outer defences. Legends associate it with a time before iron, and with conflicts remembered only in myth. Whether those stories preserve historical truth is less important than the fact that they consistently place the structure in a distant past. Similar forts appear in the southwest and on the Atlantic islands. Their scale is astonishing. Walls many feet thick enclose large spaces. Entrances are carefully positioned to watch over landing places. Some include internal huts, others stand empty. On the largest island, several such forts remain. One is a simple ring with interior dwellings. Another rises on a cliff above the sea, defended by jagged stones set to trap attackers. A third consists of multiple concentric walls enclosing a vast space. No tradition explains who built them or why such immense effort was needed in such a barren place. Dún Aonghasa is the best-known stone fort on Innismore, and it leaves a mark on visitors in a way few ancient sites can. Long before anyone measures its walls or debates its date, the place speaks through its setting. The fort stands where land ends abruptly, perched above a vast Atlantic drop, and that cliff does much of the storytelling by itself. The approach builds a particular kind of tension. The more the path narrows and the wind hardens, the more the site feels cut off from ordinary life. It is not only the height or the roar of water far below, but the strange combination of beauty and threat that creates the atmosphere. People often describe a mixture of awe and unease, as if the fort's stones are still holding their breath at the edge of the world. Legends later wrap this place in the sadness of exile and pursuit, imagining it as a final refuge for a defeated people. Even if the story is not literal history, it shows how strongly the location invites themes of last stands, desperate safety, and inevitable loss. The traditional tale attached to Dún Aonghasa follows a familiar pattern in early Irish storytelling. It claims that a group called the Firbolg, beaten in a great battle by the Tuatha de Danann, fled westward and scattered into islands across the sea. Later, driven out again, they returned and were assigned land under tribute, only to flee once more when the burden became too heavy. In the story, they seek protection from powerful rulers in Connaught, and under the leadership of a prominent family, they are settled in various places. Aonghas, described as one of that leader's sons, is placed specifically at Dún Aonghasa on Innis Moor, while his brothers supposedly give their names to other locations. There was once even a separate story about the capture of the fort listed among famous romantic tales, but the actual narrative has not survived. Taken as history, this reads like a neat explanation for place names, and that is likely what it is. An attempt by later writers to stitch together fragments of older tradition with geography that was already fixed. Names existed on the landscape. Older memories existed in the culture. And medieval compilers sometimes joined them with confident logic that feels persuasive until it is tested. It is the same kind of reasoning that would claim any modern Johnstown must have been founded by a famous King John, simply because the names match. The tale may preserve real echoes, but it is also shaped by the human desire to make every name on a map come with a story attached. A different possibility sits behind the name Aonghas. Instead of a human founder, the figure may point toward an older, divine character, a hero god remembered from a pre-Celtic religious world, and later blended into the mythology of incoming, Celtic-speaking communities. In that process, earlier divinities were often reinterpreted through new religious language, and powerful local gods could be identified with major figures in the newer tradition. If that happened here, then Dún Aonghasa may have been placed under the symbolic protection of an older deity at a time when the memory of an actual builder was fading. The fort's connection to the edge of the ocean, the feeling of an almost supernatural boundary, would have made it an ideal place for that kind of sacred association. Whatever its original dedication, the physical structure is dramatic enough without legend. The fort sits along a cliff wall that rises sharply from deep water to around 300 feet. Its current shape looks like a great stone semicircle, with the cliff edge forming the straight side. Yet that form is probably misleading. It is far more likely that the original enclosure was a complete circle and that centuries of erosion have eaten away the seaward portion. The Atlantic does not negotiate with stone, and over long spans of time it can erase even monumental work. What survives today may be only the landward half of what once existed, and the same slow process will eventually remove what remains. The approach reveals a complex defensive system, built in layers. The first major feature is an outer wall that stretches for an extraordinary distance, more than 2,000 feet in its present line. It encloses a broad area along the cliff edge and reaches inland to a considerable width. For a visitor, the scale is startling because it feels less like a single fortification and more like a walled landscape. This outer wall is thick, solid, and carefully constructed, and it funnels movement through a single entrance that has survived remarkably well. Passing through that gateway is like stepping into a planned sequence rather than simply entering open ground. Further on, lies one of the most striking defences. A band of upright stones set in chaotic density, a barrier designed to break a fast attack. It forms a rough belt between the outer wall and the inner structures, and its purpose is easy to grasp even without military training. A charging force would lose speed, cohesion, and footing among those stones. The barrier varies in width, and the stones themselves rise several feet, planted in a way that seems deliberately unfriendly to human movement. Similar defences appear in a handful of other forts in Ireland and beyond, which suggests a shared idea of how to slow and expose an attacker before they reached the main wall. Over time, careless visitors have pushed stones toward the cliff, damaging the barrier at its ends, a reminder that destruction does not always arrive through conquest. Sometimes it comes through boredom. Just inside that stone belt are remains of another wall, not as long as the outer one, but thick enough to signal serious intent. The broken line suggests an earlier phase of construction, perhaps replaced or repaired after damage. In places, later building seems to snake across a breach, as if the defenders once faced a weakness and patched it with a new barrier that followed the terrain. The sequence implies development rather than a single moment of building. Walls added, replaced, and adjusted as needs changed. It also hints that the stone belt may originally have been the first line of defence, with later walls expanding the protected space outward. At the core stands the innermost citadel, surrounded by a high rampart built in stepped terraces. Even in its worn state, it rises with authority, and earlier accounts indicate it was once higher still. The wall is arranged so that movement along it can be controlled, with terraces reached by flights of steps. Inside, the space feels contained and deliberate, and the height of the stonework gives a strong sense of separation from the world outside. Not all later interventions have helped. Some added supports and repairs carried out in modern times do not match ancient methods and can mislead the eye, but the essential impression remains. This is a place designed to endure pressure. Dún Aonghasa is not alone on the Aran Islands. On Inis Meain, Dún Chonchobher stands as another major stone fort, oval in shape, with a high surrounding wall built in multiple stages. An additional outer area sits beside it, with its own guarded entrance, creating a layered plan similar in spirit to Dún Aonghasa, even if the setting differs. On the mainland, forts such as Moane in County Clare show a different kind of scale. There, multiple rings define an enormous enclosed area, suggesting something more like a fortified settlement than a single stronghold. The remains indicate systematic destruction at some point, perhaps from a raid, and nearby discoveries of valuable objects have been linked, plausibly, to the idea of plunder taken from a rich, enclosed community. Yet even in that case, the site itself has yielded little that can fix its story with certainty. In many places, later small buildings were made from the stones of older walls, silently recycling the past into the needs of a new age. Beyond stone forts and promontory defences, one of the most common ancient features across Ireland is the earthwork ring fort. These are so numerous that they almost become invisible through familiarity, scattered across fields and hills in the tens of thousands. Precisely because they are ordinary, they may be among the best clues to everyday life in earlier centuries. Their forms vary widely. Some are simple circular banks, enclosing a modest space. Others add a ditch, sometimes outside the bank, sometimes inside. Many have a clear entrance gap, and where a ditch exists, there is often a raised causeway aligned with the opening. Some forts multiply their defences with 2 or 3 banks, though more than 3 is uncommon. In certain examples, a bank is doubled in a way that creates a raised passage with parapets on both sides, adding complexity without necessarily increasing the overall size. Compound forms also exist. 2 or 3 enclosures may sit close together or even touch, creating shapes that resemble linked circles. In such cases, it is not always clear whether the result was planned as one structure or formed from separate forts built near each other. Where there are multiple rings, entrances often do not line up. A person entering the outer gap might be forced to walk along the ditch line before reaching the inner entrance. This creates a tactical disadvantage for an intruder, exposing their side to defenders. It is a simple idea, but an effective one, and it shows that at least some builders were thinking carefully about control of movement, rather than relying on height alone. Most ring forts are nearly perfect circles, so regular that they must have been laid out with some practical method, perhaps by fixing a cord at a central point and tracing a consistent radius. Yet, not all are circular. Some are shaped like a letter D, with one straight side, and others are rectangular. It is often suggested that these non-circular forms are later, though the evidence is not always strong enough to turn that into a rule. In a few cases, bronze objects have been found in association with ring forts, hinting that some types may reach back into the Bronze Age, but without systematic survey and careful excavation, it remains difficult to map precise patterns by region or date. What is clear is that these structures are vulnerable. Old beliefs that once discouraged interference have weakened, and modern land use can erase these sites quickly, sometimes without anyone pausing to record them. Construction methods range from pure earth banks to mixtures of earth and stone, and sometimes earthworks are paired with stone walls. Some forts remain impressive even after many centuries of weathering, while others are low and faint, visible mainly as gentle rings in grass. Inside, the evidence varies as well. Many show no sign of internal divisions, but others contain foundations of small guard chambers, near entrances, stone-built enclosures, and underground passages and chambers, sometimes complex enough to suggest planned storage, shelter, or escape routes. The purpose of ring forts was not uniform. Some that look like forts may in fact be burial places. Many were likely farmsteads, places where families lived, with their animals and stores protected by banks and ditches. Others may have functioned as cattle pens. Interestingly, a number of ring forts stand in locations that make little sense if they were intended to resist human siege. They can be overlooked by nearby higher ground, allowing attackers to dominate them. That weakness may not be a mistake. In certain periods, the greatest threat was not organized armies, but predators, especially wolves. In such a world, a fortified enclosure is less about surviving war and more about defending livestock at night, protecting the community's wealth from a relentless natural enemy. The walls would not need to withstand a prolonged attack by determined fighters. They would need to discourage raids by animals, slow sudden intrusions, and create a secure boundary around a settlement. Dating these structures remains difficult. Some are late enough that builders reused older inscribed stones as construction material in underground passages, taking them from earlier graves and cutting or breaking them as needed. Others may be far older, possibly reaching back into the Bronze Age. Yet excavation has often produced little beyond fragments of pottery or small traces of everyday life. Not the kind of dramatic finds that draw attention. That lack of spectacle is part of why the subject has been neglected, even though these forts may be the closest surviving footprints of ordinary existence over long stretches of Irish history. From these landscapes of stone and earth, the narrative naturally turns toward religion, because many of these sites sit beside burial grounds, assembly places, and ritual routes. Reconstructing ancient belief, however, is far harder than describing walls. Imagine two experts studying the same complex system, one with clear diagrams and carefully labelled samples. The other, forced to work from material that has been damaged, mixed up, and partly replaced with misleading labels. That second expert will not be incapable, but the task will be more uncertain and the conclusions less secure. That is the situation faced when trying to recover the religious ideas of Stone and Bronze Age communities. The evidence is fragmentary, edited by later hands, and often distorted by the assumptions of people who did not fully understand what they saw or heard. The history of scholarship shows how easy it is to chase attractive explanations too far. In the past, myths were routinely reduced to stories about the sun, dawn, and sky, as if every hero's birth and death was simply sunrise and sunset, told in human language. When that approach weakened under criticism, new universal explanations took its place, such as the idea that many myths and rituals revolve around vegetation and the cycle of growth and harvest. There is truth in both directions, but the danger begins when any single key is forced to open every door. Another approach treats myths as distorted memories of real events. That can work in some contexts, but it fails when the same story appears in distant places, suggesting shared narrative patterns, rather than a single historical origin. Even for cultures like Greece and Rome, where texts, inscriptions, and temples survive in abundance, major religious puzzles remain unsolved. For northwestern Europe, the situation is far worse. Classical authors provide only brief, selective observations. Inscriptions may name gods, but explain little about them. Sculptures hint at attributes, but not meanings. Native stories often reach the page through later editors who reshaped them in line with new beliefs, leaving only traces of older religion embedded in heroic tales and folklore. There are no surviving temples in many regions, only enigmatic stone monuments and burial structures. And even when religious material is found, it is often hard to separate what belongs to Celtic-speaking communities from what may reflect older pre-Celtic traditions beneath them. A practical way to approach ancient religion is to look at what early communities most likely revered. One major element is the cult of the dead. In societies facing hunger, irregular living conditions, and little scientific explanation for unusual experiences, visions, and dreamlike encounters with the dead could feel vivid and real. The boundary between the living and the departed might seem thin, and the dead could be imagined as powerful forces who must be respected, feared, or appeased. Alongside that sits the cult of animals. Even now, the inner world of an animal is largely unknowable, and in a world closer to wilderness, the strength, speed, and strange habits of animals can make them feel superhuman. Then there are the great forces of nature: wind, rain, sun, storm, thunder, and the cycle of fertility and growth that determines whether people live well or starve. Traces of these patterns appear repeatedly in Irish tradition. One of the most important figures linked to a major burial landscape is Aonghasa, associated with the great complex near the Moane. Massive tombs and monuments there clearly point to powerful individuals and intense ritual investment in the dead. Tradition connects Aonghasa to that place with remarkable consistency, and it is possible that behind the later myth stands a memory of an early leader who became divine in story after death. In later periods, such a figure could be identified with a major god of an incoming culture, reshaped in name and function while keeping the aura of older sanctity. Stories preserve hints of continuing devotion. A narrative about a saint describes a pagan figure calling on Aonghasa for protection while travelling, suggesting that even in Christian times the name still carried weight in popular imagination. Another well-known tale ends with Aonghasa arriving in grief to claim the body of a fallen hero. refusing to let others take him away, and promising to keep a spirit presence that could speak with him each day. Whether this is theology, poetry, or the residue of old occult ideas, it presents Aonghasa as a protector tied to specific people and places, and it frames burial as something guarded by divine authority rather than left to ordinary hands. Large seasonal gatherings also point toward older religious structures. Many assemblies took place beside ancient cemeteries, binding public ritual to the presence of the dead. At the same time, their timing aligns with key turning points in the year, suggesting links to seasonal change and agricultural rhythm. Certain gatherings mark the start of summer, others the beginning of harvest time, others the opening of winter, when growth dies back and the year darkens. Some traditions also suggest a spring renewal feast, fitting the wider pattern of celebrating the return of life after scarcity. Such rhythms are not unique to Ireland. They appear wherever farming and herding shape survival, and where ritual becomes a way to negotiate uncertainty. Animal worship follows a recognizable evolution in many cultures. At first, the species itself may feel sacred, powerful, and mysterious. Later, as humans assert control, the focus can shift to a particular extraordinary animal remembered from the past. A creature whose story is told as if it were unique and monumental. Over time, that animal may become merged with a human-shaped god, or with a hero who moves between animal and human identity. Irish tradition contains famous animal figures of this kind. Great bulls and destructive boars. Legendary pigs that carve boundaries into the land, even comic or parodic versions of animal kings that may echo older, sacred motifs. A story that explains a rebel leader's nickname by claiming his god took the shape of a cat may not be evidence of actual cat worship, but it shows that the idea of animal-shaped divinities was imaginable and meaningful in the cultural memory. Water, too, seems to carry deep religious weight. Wells and springs attract ritual attention in both legend and custom. River reverence may be especially ancient, hinted at by the way some river names resist later explanation, as if they preserve older languages or older sacred identities. In some regions, rivers bear simple descriptive names or take the names of nearby towns, while in other cases the names seem to come from a deeper layer of speech. That pattern could suggest that certain rivers once carried names tied to divinities, and that in places where those names were lost or avoided, later communities replaced them with practical labels. One more figure stands at the centre of many early religious systems: the king. In some traditions, the ruler is not only a political leader, but a living guarantee of fertility, prosperity, and order. Good harvests are linked to the king's rightness, famine and disease to his failure. Such a concept surrounds the ruler with strict taboos and obligations, not as superstition for its own sake, but as a way of protecting the community's relationship with the forces that sustain life. In some stories, physical perfection is required, and the ruler's position can be challenged violently, as if defeating him proves a transfer of divine worth. Comparable patterns appear in many parts of the world, suggesting an old logic in which leadership and sacred power are bound together. The rituals used to honour and calm these unseen forces form a crucial part of the picture. Many of these actions blended what might now be called magic with what later generations would recognise as religion. Scholars have long argued over which came first. One view suggests that people originally believed they could directly influence nature through imitation. When rain failed, water was poured onto the ground in the hope that the act itself would cause rain to fall. In the same way, harming an image of an enemy was believed to injure the real person. Over time, such acts became fixed customs. Their original purpose faded, Stories were invented to explain them, and gods slowly emerged as characters within those stories. Another interpretation sees these actions less as attempts to control nature and more as physical appeals. Pouring water onto the earth becomes a wordless request, a visible statement of need directed toward higher powers. Rather than forcing an effect, the act demonstrates desire. For many reasons, this second explanation fits the evidence more convincingly. These actions look less like crude manipulation and more like symbolic communication. Only a limited selection of material survives that allows insight into how such rites were performed. One of the most important traditions is the story of St. Patrick and the idol known as Crom Cruach. At first glance, it appears to describe purely Celtic worship, but closer examination suggests something deeper. When new peoples arrived, they often adopted local religious practices rather than erasing them. The earlier inhabitants were assumed to know how the powers of the land should be approached. Entering a new territory without understanding its spiritual rules was considered dangerous, so adaptation was natural. According to tradition, Patrick reached a plain known as Mag Slecht, usually placed somewhere in what is now County Cavan. There stood what was called the chief idol of Ireland, named Crom Cruach, made of gold and surrounded by 12 stone figures. Stripped of later interpretation, this description matches the form of a stone circle, a central focus with a surrounding ring of stones. Many such monuments survive across Ireland. Most follow a similar plan, a ring of stones accompanied by one dominant stone placed slightly apart, often larger than the rest. Sometimes this stone stands inside the circle, but more often it stands just outside it. In several places, the dominant stone is especially striking, rising higher than the others and drawing immediate attention. An ancient Irish poem describing Mag Slecht gives rare detail about what happened at such a site. It speaks of prostration, of bodily gestures of submission, and of offerings made to ensure fertility, prosperity, and survival. It also describes acts that are deeply disturbing to modern sensibilities, including the sacrifice of children and even of a king. The aim of these rites was clear: to secure abundance in crops and livestock. The poem also claims that Patrick destroyed the monument, striking down the stones and ending the cult. Whether every detail is historically exact is less important than the fact that such traditions existed at all. They reflect memories of real practices, preserved within a society that still remembered its pagan past, with remarkable clarity. Attempts to deny the reality of human sacrifice in ancient Ireland stem more from modern discomfort than from evidence. Similar practices are recorded across the world in societies at comparable stages of development. Acknowledging this does not diminish the people of the past. It allows a more honest understanding of how they tried to cope with uncertainty, fear, and dependence on forces they could not control. Sacrifice was not the only ritual involved. Dance clearly played a central role. Across Ireland, stories claim that stones in circles were once people who danced in forbidden ways and were turned to stone as punishment. Such legends are not random inventions. They preserve distorted memories of ritual dancing performed at these sites. Similar names and stories appear elsewhere in Europe. In Britain, one famous monument was once called the Giant's Dance. In Cornwall, stone circles were known as dancing stones. The pattern is consistent. Movement, rhythm, and circular motion were essential elements of worship. These dances were likely performed in a sunwise direction, moving clockwise around the sacred centre, keeping the right hand toward the middle. This direction was associated with luck, order, and harmony. At Tara, a vanished stone circle was remembered as a place where people moved in this manner before battle. hoping to gain success. Originally, such movement was meant to support the natural order, especially the path of the sun through the sky. Over time, layers of meaning accumulated, and the original purpose became blurred. Some rituals also involved sound, and not just music or chanting. There is strong reason to believe that a device known today as a bull roarer was used. This simple instrument, a flat piece of wood spun on a cord, produces a deep, wavering roar unlike any other sound. In many cultures, it was believed to be the voice of a god. It was used to summon participants, to exclude the uninitiated, and to create an atmosphere of awe. In Ireland, references survive that suggest this sound was associated with sacred authority. The famous cry of the inauguration stone at Tara may have been produced in this way. To those who heard it, the sound did not belong to a human hand but to a divine presence speaking through it. The name Crom Cruach itself deserves attention. Outside the Patrick tradition, there is little independent evidence for a god with this name. It may be a hostile nickname applied by later Christian writers, rather than the original divine name. What matters more is the structure itself. The circle is not just a place where dancing occurred. It is a permanent image of the dance. The central stone represents the chief power, while the surrounding stones form an endless procession frozen in place. The stones are not merely symbols, but are treated as living vessels of sacred force. Single standing stones are even more common than stone circles. Some are modest, others tower dramatically over the landscape. They served many purposes over long periods. Some marked boundaries or significant locations. Others clearly marked graves. Legal texts from early Ireland refer to stones of adoration, showing that these monuments were once treated as objects of reverence. Even when used as grave markers, they were not simple memorials. They were believed to house or anchor the spirit of the dead, providing a point where offerings and respect could be directed. Most standing stones are unworked slabs, but a small number were shaped to resemble the human form. These are rare, likely because they were deliberately destroyed when beliefs changed. One striking example survives in a churchyard, clearly carved to suggest a person while bearing Christian symbolism. This shows how older forms were sometimes reshaped, rather than erased, preserving memory beneath new meanings. Another important class of monument is the stone alignment, rows of upright stones set in straight lines, sometimes in parallel groups. Ireland does not possess examples on the scale seen in Brittany, but several alignments are impressive in their own right. Their purpose is still debated, but ritual use is almost certain. In many cases, the stones we see today are likely only the surviving framework of more complex structures. Wood, earth, and woven materials may once have completed these sacred spaces, leaving little trace behind. At certain sites, arrangements of stones suggest entrances into enclosed ritual areas. Paired stones resemble gateposts, leading toward a central sacred focus. Some local place names still preserve a memory of these gateways as passages into a special realm. In a few cases, carved stones covered with circular designs stand at the heart of these arrangements, reinforcing the idea that they marked the core of ritual activity. Among all these monuments, one stands out as particularly extraordinary. A long stone-built structure near Sligo known today as Leek Con Mick Ruiz. Its form is unlike a simple tomb. A long central space is flanked by chambers entered through massive stone doorways. Excavation revealed both human and animal bones, along with stone tools but no metal. Its scale, complexity, and careful design suggest something more than burial alone. It resembles a temple, a place where ritual actions unfolded over time, rather than a single moment of interment. The builders of such monuments possessed neither metal tools nor advanced machinery, yet they moved and positioned stones weighing many tons. This required planning, cooperation, and strong leadership. Every dolmen and stone temple stands as proof of organized society and shared belief. These structures were not casual creations. They demanded communal effort driven by powerful religious motivation. Dolmens appear across a wide geographic range, from East Asia to Western Europe, with notable gaps and concentrations. They are absent in some regions and abundant in others. This uneven spread suggests not a single migrating people, but the movement of ideas. Religious concepts, methods of honouring the dead, and visions of the sacred landscape travelled along certain routes, carried by contact rather than conquest. Just as later religions spread across cultures and languages, so this earlier system left its mark on diverse communities. Within Ireland, the distribution of dolmens follows natural pathways. They cluster along coastlines, river valleys, and areas that were likely less forested. Dense woodland once covered much of the interior, making movement difficult. Rivers and shores were the highways of the past. Dolmens appear where people could travel, trade, and share ideas. In the west, they line the coast and the great river systems. In the north, they concentrate around Sligo. Elsewhere, they trace the outlines of ancient lakes and waterways. The pattern is not random. It reflects how people moved through the land and how belief travelled with them. In the northern province, the pattern is less sharply defined than elsewhere, yet the same general logic still appears. Most dolmens, and all of the larger concentrations, lie either along the coastline or in areas connected to major bodies of water, such as Loch Erne. A particularly dense cluster appears near Lough Swilly, which accounts for most of the examples in Donegal, while the interior lands of Tyrone remain strikingly sparse by comparison. Leinster shows this pattern even more clearly. Dolmens are confined to narrow corridors. The coast around Dublin, the valley of the River Suir in Kilkenny, the course of the Barrow in the same county, and the Boyne Basin in Meath. Vast inland areas show little or no trace of this type of monument. Such a distribution cannot be accidental. When considering the spread of dolmens, the availability of suitable stone must be taken into account. Yet this factor itself is closely tied to ancient woodland cover. Stone suitable for large monuments is more easily accessible, where soil is thin or absent, and soil in turn implies forest growth. Dense woodland would have posed an enormous obstacle to the transport of massive stones, requiring long corridors to be cleared through trees and undergrowth. Although Stone Age communities clearly possessed the determination and organisation to move heavy blocks over long distances, forests would have been the single greatest impediment to such work. For this reason, the pattern of dolmen distribution closely mirrors the ancient limits of woodland. Where forests were dense, dolmens are rare. Where the land was open or easily reached by water, they are common. The question of how these monuments were actually built has long fascinated observers. Only educated guesswork is possible. Highly complex systems involving elaborate timber frameworks and advanced mechanical devices are sometimes proposed. But such reconstructions rely more on modern ingenuity than on archaeological probability. A simpler explanation fits the evidence better. The builders likely had access to large numbers of workers, whether voluntarily assembled or compelled by authority. They possessed ropes, wooden beams that could serve as levers and rollers, basic digging tools, and, most importantly, experienced supervision. Someone had to judge whether uprights were stable enough to carry the weight of the capstone and whether the span between supports was suitable. Construction probably began with the stones laid flat on the ground near their intended positions. Pits were then dug for the uprights, which were raised gradually using levers and supported at each stage with packing stones or earth. Once vertical, their bases were wedged securely. When the supports were stable, an earthen ramp was built from ground level up to their tops. The capstone was dragged up this ramp using rollers and ropes, eased into place, and the ramp was then removed. The finished monument emerged fully formed, with no need for advanced machinery. Why was such immense effort invested? A long-standing popular belief describes dolmens as sacrificial altars. This explanation fails on every practical level. Altars require flat, horizontal surfaces, yet dolmen capstones are usually rounded or slanted. Many monuments stand several feet above the ground, making access awkward and ritual use implausible. The idea belongs more to romantic imagination than to serious study. A far more convincing interpretation sees dolmens as symbolic houses. They resemble dwellings in form and scale, designed as permanent homes for the spirit of the dead. In fact, some have been reused as shelters by impoverished families in relatively recent times, demonstrating how closely their structure resembles a functional building. These were not necessarily burial chambers themselves. In many cases, they are too open for that purpose. The body was placed in the earth beneath, and the dolmen erected above as a monument and as a focus for offerings. It was a house for the soul, not a tomb in the modern sense. A small number of Irish dolmens bear carved markings, though these are few and difficult to interpret. Some resemble writing, but have no linguistic meaning. Others may simply be tool-sharpening marks or abstract symbols. They suggest that symbolic expression sometimes accompanied burial, but no clear system has yet been identified. Dolmens appear in several distinct forms. The simplest is the trilithon, consisting of 2 uprights and a single capstone. This form is rare. More common is the standard type with 1 large capstone supported by 3 or more uprights. Some examples use as many as 10 or 11 supports, and their capstones can weigh dozens of tons. In another variation, the capstone rests partly on the ground, forming a sloping roof, rather than a raised chamber. These massive structures were almost certainly designed that way, rather than having collapsed into their present positions. Another form uses an intermediate slab to support the main cover, creating a stepped structure. Beyond these are monuments with extended roofed chambers formed by multiple capstones laid in sequence. These long-covered galleries appear throughout the country and represent a closely related tradition. Many dolmens were enclosed within rings of stone or earth. These enclosures mark sacred ground, separating it from ordinary space. They may also have served to confine the spirit of the dead, preventing it from wandering among the living. In some cases, dolmens were paired with standing stones, reinforcing their symbolic importance. With the arrival of the Bronze Age, burial customs changed dramatically. Cremation spread across large parts of Europe and eventually became dominant. This shift reflects a profound change in belief. Burning the body destroys any possibility of physical return. The soul was no longer thought to linger near the corpse, but to depart fully into another realm. Yet belief in life after death did not diminish. Grave goods continued to be offered, often in greater quantity than before. But now they too were burned, so their essence could accompany the spirit. Burial practices during this period were far from uniform. Some bodies were buried directly in the ground. Others were placed in stone-lined cists, sometimes underground, sometimes at the surface, sometimes beneath mounds of earth or stone. Cremated remains might be placed in urns, inverted or upright, or scattered in parcels on stone slabs. Caves, both natural and artificial, were also used. Simple earth burials leave little trace, especially in damp soils. As a result, the graves of ordinary people have largely vanished. Where urns were used, identification becomes easier. Many such burials show no surface marker at all. Cremation and inhumation sometimes appear side by side, suggesting that both practices could coexist. Differences in posture, urn placement, and covering stones hint at ritual variation rather than strict rules. Stone-lined cists were often small and carefully constructed. Some contained urns, others held unburnt bodies placed in a crouched position. Occasionally grave goods appear, such as beads, armlets, flint tools, or symbolic vessels whose purpose remains uncertain. Double cists and paired burials suggest family relationships or social hierarchy. In some cemeteries, large central cists are surrounded by many smaller ones. These arrangements suggest collective burial events, possibly following battles or disasters. Empty central cists likely served as symbolic graves for leaders whose bodies were never recovered. The surrounding burials appear carefully arranged, implying a single coordinated ceremony rather than gradual accumulation. Standing stones frequently accompany such burials. These stones were not mere markers. Traditional names imply that they were regarded as substitute bodies, places where the essence of the dead could reside. This belief echoes widespread folklore in which trees or stones absorb the life force of the deceased. Even in later times, reluctance to disturb grave vegetation reflects the survival of this ancient idea. Cave burials form one of the most striking traditions. Artificial chambers were constructed either below or above ground, roofed with carefully arranged stone slabs. These chambers often contain a central pillar, probably symbolic rather than structural, surrounded by compartments holding burnt and unburnt remains. Similar arrangements recur across different sites, indicating a shared ritual system. Some of the most impressive examples appear near major ceremonial centres. Here, entire landscapes became sacred cemeteries, filled with mounds, chambers, standing stones, and enclosures. The largest of these monuments dominate their surroundings and must have required extraordinary communal effort. Among all such sites, none surpasses the Great Mound at Newgrange. Its scale, architectural sophistication, and symbolic decoration set it apart from every other monument north of the Alps. Unlike stone circles whose meaning remains elusive, Newgrange is saturated with memory. It was not simply a tomb, but a sanctuary, a place where a powerful figure was buried, transformed into a divine presence, and remembered for generations. The carved stones lining its passages speak in a symbolic language, still only partly understood, preserving the worldview of a people who sought permanence in stone and meaning in death.